One of the most noted conversations in Scripture takes place between Jesus and Pilate, and it is narrated to us in the 18th chapter of the Gospel of John. You recall that many of the religious leaders of that time were trying to expedite the process, and they were trying with their machinations to create the scenario where Jesus would immediately be pronounced guilty and they could get on with the execution. But it was a religious time in their calendar, and they could not pollute themselves by going to the wrong places or being in touch with the wrong objects. So as they came to the home of this Gentile Pilate, they could not really enter in. So to keep themselves ceremonially clean, they kept themselves on the outside, and Pilate invited Jesus in and asked him a few questions. And this is the way the conversation went as Jesus and he interacted. It says this: Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea," Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." I am convinced this is one of those hinge verses of the New Testament. I wish I could expound on that verse alone. What is intriguing about this comprehensive and poignant reply from Jesus to the various questions of Pilate is that Pilate then raises possibly the most important question ever raised by a human being, only he never paused for the answer. It says, "What is truth?" Pilate asked, and with that he went out. "What is truth?" Pilate asked, and with that he went out. And as we look at our society today, it is probably the most nagging question of our time. I was on the outskirts of Fullerton, California, sharing a week of meetings with the renowned biblical teacher, Chuck Swindoll. And I remember the first night as we sat around the dinner table, exchanging notes on the theme that we both were to address as we were alternating for that period of 5 days. And at our table was a high school teacher in that particular area in Fullerton. And he leaned over to me and Chuck and said, "Have you heard the latest of what has happened with 5 of my students?" I had to be filled in with the details. 5 young men who were his students in that prestigious high school. They were A+ students. Most of them had already been accepted into the Ivy League schools of Princeton and Harvard. These 5 young men ran a kind of a vicious ring within that community where they would sit in for the SAT examinations of other students and charge them anywhere from $800 to $1,500 so that they could get them high quality scores and get them into the top universities in the country. They had learned how to plug into computer systems of the educational network and alter grades for students and guarantee them such selection processes. And 5 of them had one in their midst who decided to break ranks. And what the end result was, these 4 boys got wind of the possibility that this fellow was going to break ranks with them, and in a brutal sling with the baseball bat, bludgeoned the head of this young man. All of these young fellows were involved in their teens, and smashed his skull in a brutal butchery, wrapped him in a plastic bag, and buried him in a shallow grave. You wonder, how can a brilliant young man like that, who headed this little team, be involved in such a mindless massacre and ruin his entire future? A few weeks ago, I was speaking in Wales, and at the end of my talk, where there were nearly 3,000 people present, a young man got up to pray and broke down in the middle of his prayer as he reflected on the message and applied it to the situation in their community where a 2-year-old baby was battered and pulverized at the hands of 2 little boys about 8 and 10 years old. What has happened to us as a people? Why are we doing such mindless things? Why is it that we are getting younger and younger in such dastardly and damnable crimes? When are we going to wake up to the fact that ideas have consequences? We have fed a whole generation with a whole swelter of lies, and they've bought into it. They've bought into it. Flying into Toronto, I was looking at a magazine I had never heard of called Liz. It was left in the seat by the woman sitting next to me. He'd been reading it. It's an interview of a very distinguished professor in New York, a woman by the name of Kuntz, Stephanie Kuntz. She's written a book entitled The Way We Never Were. The Way We Never Were, trying to cast a shadow upon the fact that the family was ever supposed to be what we are making it out to be in the past. She says we've romanticized it. And the woman interviewing her, one of the editors, makes this comment, and I quote, "We have got to crack this illusion." Listen now. "It was a liberating day for me," says this interviewer, "when I recognized I was entitled to dislike my mother." Not explain it, not even try to understand what is going on. I was entitled to dislike my mother. And then the next paragraph went on to show, she says we've got a lot to learn from the homosexual and lesbian community of what family is all about. And then the conversation goes on. We have got a lot to learn from our nearest relatives, the chimpanzees, about what community is all about. This from a professor, and it is going to become a bestseller. I can see it. What has happened to us? Let me read for you, years ago, what one of the most noted theologians of our time, one of the greatest minds, even acclaimed by the Washington Post as one of the brightest theologians on the landscape, Carl F.H. Henry, in his book, The Christian Mindset in a Secular Society, says this: biblical truth, transcultural as it is, has an indispensable message for contemporary culture. It addresses modern learning, modern ethics, modern political and economic concerns, and all the idolatries of our polytheistic society. It proclaims the gospel, listen now please, to a generation that is intellectually uncapped, morally unzippered, and volitionally uncurbed. Those who consider the latest fads permanently in will of course dismiss the Christian message as the last hurrah of an antiquated outlook. They reveal their sickness of soul by derogating terms like morality, piety, family, work, patriotism, born again, evangelical, theology. Christianity they dismiss as a kind of middle-class hedonism. Declaring it intellectually inadmissible, they meanwhile espouse a life that neither reason nor conscience nor spirit can support or condone. Repression of sensuality and of self-gratification they call psychotically abnormal. Subordination of the flesh they leave to medieval monks or consign to the future resurrection. Affirming sexual pleasure to be the supreme good of a life of unending revelry, they waste away into ethical ghosts and skeletons. Biblical truth, transcultural as it is, has an indispensable message for modern man, one who is intellectually uncapped, volitionally uncurbed, and morally unzippered. Just think of that statement, how descriptive it is of our times. So I have raised the question, what has happened to truth in our day? Where did we lose out? Where did we go wrong? What has become the malady that best describes why we are on the wrong track? And I give you three reasons, three ways of determining truth in our time that has led us into this arena of lies and falsehood, where we are risking the whole next generation with a false sense of entitlements. Number one, revelation has been displaced by reason. Revelation has been displaced by reason. And if you go back across the centuries, you will see the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant beginning to lay the foundation for what went wrong here. He is the one at whose door much of this has to stop. But interestingly enough, Immanuel Kant was a believer. He claimed to be a follower of Christ. He was a rationalist. He brought focus on the mind and the brain and its capacity to think rationally. Immanuel Kant made some of these comments which are fascinating. He said this. He said, there are two things that ever grip me in wonder and in awe: the starry hosts above and the moral law within. The starry hosts above and the moral law within. With that as a starting point, you could be a little bit sympathetic to Kant. You can see how he recognized there was a wonder in creation and there was a wonder within the categories of right and wrong within him. The starry hosts above and the moral law within forever holds me in awe. But Kant was trying to find an answer for what is right and what is wrong, what is ethical and what is unethical. And Kant made a fundamental mistake in philosophy. You may never read Immanuel Kant, your children will. You may never hear of him from here on in, but your children in universities will. Please listen. Immanuel Kant made this deduction that if you want to understand who God is, you cannot come to God by the mind or by reason. It is purely that leap of faith. And he said theological language did not fall into rational categories like science did and like certain other disciplines did, where you could bring the mind and test it in the empirical application of the senses and the use of the mind. He brought about a false dichotomy and put the God talk into a completely different language and reason into a completely different language. From there on, subsequent philosophers have taken their hits against theology and assumed that when you believe in God, you're not making a rational statement anymore. But the interesting thing is, Kant could continue to say that because Kant still believed in the wonder of the starry hosts above and the moral law within. What happens in our time where the moral law within is no longer revered and the starry hosts above are no longer respected as the creation of a creator? In my book, I have quoted that great English writer, Iris Murdoch, who has written a book called The Sovereignty of Good. And she is dealing with Immanuel Kant's book that is called The Groundwork of Ethics. Listen to what she says as Kant made this assumption, please hear me, that it is possible for a human being to turn away from God and turn away from Christ and by unaided reason come to a deduction on right and wrong. You don't need revelation, you don't need God, you don't need Christ. If you look within, there's a categorical imperative, said Kant. Listen to Iris Murdoch's response. How recognizable, how familiar to us is the man so beautifully portrayed by Kant in his Groundwork of Ethics, who, confronted even with Christ, turns away to consider the judgment of his own conscience and to hear the voice of his own reason. This man is still with us, says Murdoch, free, independent, lovely, powerful, rational, responsible, brave, the hero of so many novels and books of moral philosophy. The reason of existence for this attractive but misleading creature is not far to seek. He is the offspring of the age of science, confidently rational, yet increasingly aware of his alienation from the material universe which his discoveries reveal. His alienation is without cure. It is not a long step from Kant to Nietzsche to existentialism and the Anglo-Saxon ethical doctrines which in some ways closely resemble it. In fact, Kant's man already received a glorious incarnation nearly a century earlier in the work of Milton. His proper name is Lucifer. You go back across the centuries, and Satan comes to Eve and says, did God really say this? Has God revealed himself in such a manner? First the doubt, then the attack. Even though he said to you, in the day that you live that way, you shall surely die, that will not happen to you. So it's really not Immanuel Kant, is it? The proper name is Lucifer, who was confident that apart from God's voice, we can come to the conclusion on what is right and what is wrong. I don't think anything more describes modern man's malady and his unaided reason and where it leads to. The National Endowment for the Arts in 1989 in the city of New York was given a request by young artists to give them $10,000 to be able to study the fundamentals of art, representational artwork, to draw the human body, to learn the basics. And the National Endowment for the Arts turned down this request because they said it is revisionist and stifles creativity. They wanted creativity in art. And so in 1989, turned these artists down for a $10,000 request to get the basics. 1 year later, they gave $70,000 of government funds for a gallery art show, and I quote now from Michael Medved's book, Hollywood versus America. He says this, for a gallery art show that featured Sean Eichmann's presentation called The Alchemy Cabinet, which displayed a jar with the bloody fetal remains from her own abortion. $10,000, no. To learn the basics of art, no, it is not creative enough. $70,000 for a woman to show the bloody fetal remains of her own abortion in a jar as the aesthetes walked past it and called it art. Revelation has been displaced by reason and has become the most irrational thing you can ever think of. Viktor Frankl, the psychologist who formed one of three schools of psychology, the other being Adler and Freud. Viktor Frankl, who spent 2 terms in the concentration camps under the Nazis, made this comment, and I think it is brilliantly perceptive. Listen to what he says. If we present man with the concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him when we present him as an automation of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of instincts, heredity and environment. We feed the despair to which man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stages of corruption, says Frankl, in my second concentration camp in Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced, says Frankl. Listen, I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or the other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Remember that quote. It was not in the Ministry of Defense in Berlin that Auschwitz and Majdanek and Treblinka and Birkenau and Buchenwald and all were conceived, but it was conceived in the mind of some nihilistic philosophers and scientists. Alan Bloom, in his book, The Closing of the American Mind, opens his book with these words. He said, every professor on a university campus today can be absolutely sure of one thing, that almost every student coming in for an education is confident that truth is not absolute but relative. That's the way the book begins. And I present to you that the path of truth is leading us into a malaise here and into the quicksand of violence and eroticism, where we are entitled to hate our own family members, where young children are slaughtering one another. The age of reason is not doing very well, is it? Revelation has been displaced by reason. Secondly, truth has been subverted by agnosticism. Truth has been subverted by agnosticism. We pride ourselves in the fact that we don't know. Skepticism is the hallmark of university education today. You can go to campus after campus and they deny the very possibility of knowing. Fascinating, isn't it? And you come out of a university education at the end of it basically saying you cannot believe anything. You cannot know anything. How truth is subverted by agnosticism. You know, it is interesting. I don't know how many of you followed the political landscape in the United States. And you know, forgive me for branching off for a moment. It's humorous to me when I see political rhetoric today. The front page again tells the story of a social contract. I don't know the details, and I'm not commenting on whether it's good or bad. But where do you think they got that term from? It's not been coined today, is it? You go back 3 centuries ago. And Locke was talking about a social contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was talking about a social contract. Hobbes was talking out of a social contract. And 2 out of the 3 I've mentioned to you were renowned, loud-mouthed atheists. You know why that is so? You know why they called it a social contract? Because they didn't know where ethics came from. C.S. Lewis says when a ship goes into the high seas, there are 3 questions it must answer. Number 1, why it is out there in the first place. I think that's pretty reasonable. Number 2, how to keep from sinking. And number 3, how to keep from bumping into other ships. The first question answers essential ethics, why we're out here. The second question answers individual ethics, how to keep from self-destruction. And the third one answers social ethics, how to keep from bumping into each other. And Lewis goes on to say, unless you really know why you're out there in the first place, keeping from bumping into each other is merely a secondary notion. And those are our social contracts today because we don't know why we're out here in the first place. Vice presidential candidate Al Gore was debating Vice President Dan Quayle. They were arguing on the abortion issue. Dan Quayle, a very committed man, very devoutly committed to the preservation of the unborn, and risked his entire political career on that, has been mocked, possibly the most mocked politician in this continent in the last 20 years or so, where the media just took after him because of some of his beliefs, and not the least of which was his very biblical belief in the sanctity of life. And at a moment, Gore really pinned him with his back to the wall, and it took place in our home city in Atlanta. My daughter was present at the debate, and Gore was very sharp. He was brilliant. They teach you in debate, if you can't give your own answers, learn to question the opposition. And Gore looked at him eyeball to eyeball and says, Dan, would you repeat after me that a woman has the right to her own body? Would you repeat that after me, Dan? That a woman has a right to determine the destiny for her own body. 3 times he slammed him with that comment. Repeat after me, Dan. And of course, poor Mr. Quayle could not really come back and that kind of an approach. He came out with a very meaningful answer, but did not satisfy the taunt. He said, well, every time you abort a baby, you stop a beating heart. What I think would have been an ideal response would have been something like this, I think, because Senator Gore had already said he was personally against it, but politically he felt it was the right of the person to make the decision. So the response should have gone something like this, I believe. Senator Gore, would you first repeat after me that the life within that mother's womb is a human life? Would you repeat that after me? If the answer to that is yes, what are you doing obliterating life? If the answer to that is no, why are you personally against it? If the answer to that is I don't know, how many more decisions are you going to make on an agnostic platform? But they don't even know what the answer is to those questions, because agnosticism is the badge of honor today in the educational systems in which we are living. What has happened to truth in our day? Where did we lose out? Where did we go wrong? What has become the malady that best describes why we are on the wrong track? And I give you 3 reasons, 3 ways of determining truth in our time that has led us into this arena of lies and falsehood, where we are risking the whole next generation with a false sense of entitlements. Number 1, revelation has been displaced by reason. Revelation has been displaced by reason. And if you go back If you go back across the centuries, you will see the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant beginning to lay the foundation for what went wrong here. He is the one at whose door much of this has to stop. Immanuel Kant made some of these comments which are fascinating. He said this, he said, there are two things that ever grip me in wonder and in awe: the starry hosts above and the moral law within. The starry hosts above and the moral law within. With that as a starting point, you could be a little bit sympathetic to Kant. You can see how he recognized there was a wonder in creation and there was a wonder within the categories of right and wrong within him. But Kant was trying to find an answer for what is right and what is wrong, what is ethical and what is unethical. And Kant made a fundamental mistake in philosophy. Immanuel Kant made this deduction that if you want to understand who God is, you cannot come to God by the mind or by reason. It is purely that leap of faith. But the interesting thing is, Kant could continue to say that because Kant still believed in the wonder of the starry hosts above and the moral law within. What happens in our time where the moral law within is no longer revered and the starry hosts above are no longer respected as the creation of a creator? Revelation has been displaced by reason. Secondly, truth has been subverted by agnosticism. Truth has been subverted by agnosticism. We pride ourselves in the fact that we don't know. Skepticism is the hallmark of university education today. You can go to campus after campus and they deny the very possibility of knowing. Fascinating, isn't it? And you come out of a university education at the end of it basically saying you cannot believe anything. You cannot know anything. How truth is subverted by agnosticism. You go back 3 centuries ago, and Locke was talking about a social contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was talking about a social contract. Hobbes was talking out of a social contract. And 2 out of the 3 I've mentioned to you were renowned, loud-mouthed atheists. You know why that is so? You know why they called it a social contract? Because they didn't know where ethics came from. C.S. Lewis says when a ship goes into the high seas, there are 3 questions it must answer. Number 1, why it is out there in the first place. I think that's pretty reasonable. Number 2, how to keep from sinking. And number 3, how to keep from bumping into other ships. The first question answers essential ethics, why we're out here. The second question answers individual ethics, how to keep from self-destruction. And the third one answers social ethics, how to keep from bumping into each other. And Lewis goes on to say, unless you really know why you're out there in the first place, keeping from bumping into each other is merely a secondary notion. And those are our social contracts today because we don't know why we're out here in the first place. But you go back to the rhetoric in the electoral process in the United States. One of them was talking about the New World Order. Where did he get that from? He didn't coin it. You go back and get it in the writings of H.G. Wells. He talked about a New World Order. What none of the politicians told us is that H.G. Wells' last book was called The Mind at the End of Its Tether, and he said his optimistic humanism and the New World Order was not going to work. Because he didn't know either why the ships were out there in the first place. The story is told of a Mexican by the name of Jose Rivera. It's a cute little story. Pause for a little chuckle here. And he was robbing several banks in Texas and leaving them quite shattered. And so they hired a rather huge southern sheriff to go after Jose Rivera and track him down. And so the sheriff, with his usual girth, got his guns on it and arrived in the small Mexican town. And he goes into a bar and he sees a young man sitting there and he says, I'm looking for a man by the name of Jose Rivera. And the young man drinking away at his glass points to an older man sitting in the other end of the bar, the only other occupant of the bar, says, "That's Jose Rivera." So the sheriff goes over and says, "Are you Jose Rivera?" And the man shrugs his shoulders, basically saying he couldn't speak English. So they call this young fellow to interpret them for them. Sheriff says, "Are you Jose Rivera?" And he says, Are you Jose Rivera?" Jose Rivera says, "Yes, I am. So what?" He says to the sheriff, he says, "Yes, I am. So what?" And this goes back and forth. Finally, the sheriff says, "Look, I've been sent here on a mission. I have been asked to bring you back. And or else if you give the money to me, I will take the money and leave you alone. But if you don't give the money back that you have robbed, I will shoot you instantly." So he says, he tells me to tell you that he's been sent here to arrest you. You can give him the money back. If you give him the money back, it's all right. And he goes on to say, if you don't tell him where the money is, he's going to shoot you. So Jose Rivera says, "All right, tell him this. If he goes out of the door, makes a right, rides along for 1 mile, he will see a well. Beside the well, there's a huge slab of concrete stone. And if he lifts that concrete stone, he will see a big hole in the ground. Then he will see several mail bags. And if he starts pulling the mail bags, all those hundreds of thousands of dollars are in there. Go out, make a right, go for a mile, buy a well, big hole on that slab. You'll find all these bags." And the interpreter looks at the sheriff and says, "Jose Rivera says, go ahead and shoot." You see, somewhere in the self-serving interest of the interpreter, the translation was lost. George MacDonald has said this: "To give truth to him who loves it not is but to give him more plentiful material for misinterpretation." To give truth to him who loves it not is but to give him more plentiful material for misinterpretation. You see, in Luke chapter 7, we have a marvelous passage of scripture that I think we often misinterpret. Jesus says this: "To what then can I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They're like children sitting in a marketplace and calling out to each other. We played the flute for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge for you and you did not cry. For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say here is a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by all her children." We often interpret this, please allow me to say this, possibly in a faulty way. The tendency is to think of John the Baptist playing the dirge, as it were, and Jesus playing the flute, as it were, and the children of this generation did not respond. That's not what it is saying. It says, "To what shall I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in a marketplace, saying, we played the flute for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge for you and you did not mourn." John came with the message of the law. They wanted to change it into a dance. Jesus came with the message of grace. They wanted to change it into a dirge. I am convinced whatever message God has for this generation, they are determined to change it and come up with the opposite. And Jesus said to Pilate, "Are you asking this question on your own, or has somebody else told you to ask this question of me?" Pilate is exasperated, and I said, "I didn't bring you here." And Jesus said to him, "Yes, I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world, and they that are on the side of truth listen to me." I wrote this comment down after reading this passage. Please hear it. It says this: in any interplay or confrontation between a person and information, the first test is not the veracity of the information, but the truthfulness of the person. Intent is prior to content. And the question is, does this generation really want the truth? Do they want to hear the truth about the purity of our bodies? Do they want to hear the truth of the sanctity of life? Do they want to hear the truth about what sin is all about? Or like Jose Rivera's friend out there serving as interpreter, are they determined on changing the message in order to satisfy their own desires? And political expediency stalks the landscape today. How in the name of reason can any sensible human being say, I personally believe it is wrong, but politically it is the right thing to do? Sir, if that is a life in its mother's womb, then politically it's a damnable thing to do if you're doing it for expediency's sake. But what is truth? And they walk away. You see, the first thing we learn is that reason is limited. The second thing we learn is that the will is alienated. So reason, revelation displaced by reason, truth subverted by agnosticism, rationalism fails, existentialism fails, and lastly, the propositional is replaced by the visual. The propositional has been replaced by the visual. This is possibly the darkest reality of our time. I had one of the greatest privileges of my life, and I know I will talk about it for the rest of my life. I had the privilege of spending an afternoon with one of my heroes, Malcolm Muggeridge, 7 months before he died. Walking in his garden in Sussex, England, bent over there he was, I think in his 86th year or so. And very, very fragile, but in so many ways still so eloquent. It was a marvelous afternoon to walk with Malcolm on one side and his wife Kitty on the other. He's a man who'd seen the pomp of demagogues. He'd seen kingdoms come and go. He'd seen the sensuality on our campuses both in Cambridge and Edinburgh, and had resigned from his position of chaplain because of the duplicity with which educators were living. He's seen the dark night of the soul come into his own land in England. Do you realize that on Easter Sunday of this year, people were interviewed on the streets of England to ask the question, what does Easter mean? 31% of the people interviewed on the streets in England did not know what Easter meant. And 80% of them said they would not be in church the next day. Muggeridge had seen all of that. And I recall asking him, saying, Mr. Muggeridge, I said, what do you think has been your greatest contribution to writing and to the endeavor of thought? And he said to me with his piercing blue eyes, almost like a gargoyle peering out of some cathedral somewhere, he looked at me and piercingly said, I have no hesitation in giving you the answer. He said, my book, Christ and the Media, because of the illusion that the media has given to this generation, destroying it with images of falsehood and distortions night after night, as millions of us are idiotized before those screens. Christ and the Media, and in his book Christ and the Media, he tells the story, how he was in Nigeria, and there was an execution to take place during the Biafran War. Muggeridge was present. And the executioners had their rifles raised, and all of a sudden called, ready, aim, when one of the cameramen shouted from the other side, cut, my battery's dead. And the execution stood suspended till he could replace his battery pack. And bang, bang, it proceeded after his camera could roll again. Muggeridge makes this poignant comment. Some future historian may ask, wherein lay the greatest barbarism? On the part of the viewers, on the part of the executioners, or on the part of the cameras? Muggeridge shocks you by saying, I think he will plump for the cameras. The distortions and the images that are coming into our children's minds. You see, even music now is coming into their lives with pictures. The media wants to retain a total sovereignty, so they can't hear those rock songs anymore without thinking of the pictures that the rock musician is giving to them along with those songs. And now if the image doesn't work, now they call it politically correct. One of the most slanderous invasions of reality that has ever taken place. Martin Heidegger, the German existentialist who was an atheist, made an astute comment. He said, "It is not so much that words come in the world as much as the world comes into words. In the beginning was the Word." You see, languages may be invented by humanity, but language was not. And when you change the meaning of a word, you are changing the meaning of the world. Note the words that are used to describe wrong-headed lifestyles. Everything is gone, and truth vaporously has evaporated into the atmosphere. So the young scholar sitting before the professorial lectern is absolutely convinced that truth is merely relative. And what has happened is that he has failed to realize that as the propositional has been replaced by the visual, he has lost sight of the fact of what Jesus said about the eye. He said, "Let your eye be single." The eye is the lamp of the body. The romantic poet William Blake put it in these words: "This life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye." We are meant to see through the eye with the conscience. We are being taught to see with the eye devoid of a conscience. And in reality, nothing is so beautiful as the good, nothing so monotonous and boring as evil. But in our imagination, it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat. Fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. The poles have been reversed. Good has become boring. Evil has become intriguing. If you don't believe me, put on the Sermon on the Mount on television tomorrow night. Watch the ratings drop. The day after tomorrow, put David and Bathsheba and watch the ratings climb. Because in our imagination, evil is intriguing and full of charm. Now we know why 8 and 10-year-olds are slaughtering little babies. Now we can get a glimpse of why our teenagers are being battered in unexplainable hostility. Now we know, I think, why 5 young men, how they were who battered one of their own with that baseball bat. Because truth is no longer absolute. And as you see the devaluation of it, revelation has been displaced by reason, truth subverted by agnosticism, and the propositional replaced by the visual. But when we look at God's word, it reminds us reason is limited, the will is alienated, and the senses are debilitated. We can't trust unaided reason, we cannot be sure of our purity of will, and our senses empirically cannot ultimately explain all of reality. Cultural relativism and the emasculation of truth. Let me give you a very simple little illustration, and then I would like to close my time with you. May I just make a simple comment here and see if I can quote one other thing to you. It is written by a teacher in an elementary school in America. She says this: "One day last spring, I stood before 20 children of 8 and 9 in Laurie's 3rd grade class to see if any heroes or any heroines were inspiring them. I asked each child to give me the names of the 3 greatest people they had ever heard about. Michael Jackson, Brooke Shields, and Boy George," said a small blonde girl, giving me one from all 3 sexes. Michael Jackson and Spider-Man and God, said a boy, naming a new Holy Trinity. When the other children recited Michael Jackson's name was spoken again and again, but Andrew Jackson, never, or Washington or Lincoln or any other presidential immortals, no. I heard no modern equivalent of Charles Lindbergh, America's beloved lone eagle. In answer to my request for heroes, I had expected to hear such names as Michael Jackson, Brooke Shields, Spider-Man, and Mr. T from the kids, but I had not expected the replies of 8 of them who answered me. Their heroes were themselves. It is sad enough to see the faces on Mount Rushmore replaced by rock stars, brawlers, and cartoons, but it is sadder still to see Mount Rushmore replaced by a mirror. And when we look into the mirror, we don't like what we are seeing. Nancy Kerrigan won a medal. I forget if it was the silver or the bronze medal at the Olympics. This young teenager was competing against all odds. And she brought her mother with her, loved her mother, because her mother for years had poured her life into Nancy to encourage her to be a world champion someday. What was unknown to many of the viewers until it came down to the final moments was that her mother was completely blind and at best could only see shadows. And it was so touching. And as I watched it, my eyes filled up with tears, because Nancy Kerrigan had one more performance to give and was not sure she was going to make it. She had many odds to beat, and this slender young girl gave it the best shot of her life. This was her moment, and it was engaging, engrossing, and heart-throbbing to watch her mother half an inch away from the television screen trying to see the shadows of her girl performing. She couldn't really see her clearly. And as she was that close, trying to see if she'd made the triple jump, trying to see if she had had any falls, and all she was geared to was her weak eyes, but the high sensitivity of her auditory capacities as she was listening to the cheer of the crowd. And as that routine was over and the crescendo of applause went, this mother did not know what had really happened. She'd seen shadows moving on the screen. And then there was a pause as the judges' marks came up. And then the applause told the story. You could feel her heart pounding within her. Her daughter Nancy had triumphed against odds and was going to make the cut in the medal standing. And when she received that bouquet of flowers, rightly she came and gave it to her mother and embraced her. What a picture of love, adulation, commitment. In all of her blindness, she was sensitive to the sounds of triumph and defeat. With all of our awakenedness right now, we no longer hear the cries of the tragedy that stalks our land. Awake thou that sleepest, says the word. If the light within you has become darkness, how great is the darkness indeed. Rationalism, volitionalism, empiricism has seen a dark day when it does not recognize that the only light that can brighten it is the light of Christ, reason aided by him, will strengthened by him, the sensitivities energized by him. How marvelous to know that as bankrupt as such a setting is, the answer is so clear.